Hi, I'm Dan Costa, Editor-in-Chief of PCMag.com, and welcome to Fast Forward, where we have an ongoing conversation about living in the future. We're here at Mobile World Congress 2018. We are on the trade show floor. We are in the Ookla booth in the PCMag studio, and we're just talking to the leaders of the digital revolution who just happen to be walking by. I've got one of those leaders with me today. Adrian Lovett is the CEO of the World Wide Web Foundation. You may have heard of the World Wide Web. You're probably watching this video on the World Wide Web right now. It's an international organization designed to advance the web as a, I want to get this right, it's designed to advance the open web as a public good and a basic right. I think we're all in favor of that. Adrian, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks, Dan. Good to be here.
So people are familiar with the World Wide Web. Can you tell people a little bit about what the organization's mission is and how you go about achieving this lofty goal?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, people are familiar with the World Wide Web, maybe not so familiar with the guy who invented it, Tim Berners-Lee, who was beavering away in the CERN physics laboratory in Switzerland in 1989 or thereabouts, and in his spare time asked his boss if he could have a go at a little project he had in mind to take the existing platform of the internet, which in those days was a platform but not really something that people could engage with in terms of content, and to connect that with the emerging technologies around hypertext, and a couple of years later the very beginnings of what we now know as the World Wide Web were born, and Tim decided to give that to the world for free.
He probably didn't have to.
He didn't have to.
I mean, if he had gone about patenting and copyrighting, and he may not have gotten all of the patents, but he would have gotten some.
Right.
And it would have made him, I mean, wealthy beyond imagination.
Well, that's right. I mean, it's an interesting question, isn't it, Dan? Because I mean, he certainly did this as a coming from a perspective of his own sort of purpose about what he wanted to contribute to the world. But I think he would also say, actually, it was the right business decision, because by putting it out there, making it a permissionless space, something that anybody could engage with on equal terms, perhaps that's one of the key ways that it took off in the way it did. So Tim then, a few years later, when I think the reach of the World Wide Web got to about 10% of the population, already well beyond what he ever imagined would happen, he said, well, we need an organization to protect the vision, the founding vision of the web, which was, as you say, first of all, to ensure that it's for everyone, and secondly, that it should be a public good, something that supports humanity and human progress rather than gets in the way of it. So he created the World Wide Web Foundation, and here we are a few years later, and I'm very proud to be leading the organization. We have a fantastic team, not a huge team, about 30 people around the world in about 12 countries, and all working to realize that vision. And we're at this extraordinary moment. Back in those days, 10% of the world was on the web. Now 50%, almost 50%. We're at this kind of 50-50 moment. And later this year, in fact, before everyone comes back here to Barcelona this time next year, we'll pass that 50% mark. More than half the world will be online for the first time. So it's a moment to sort of take stock. I think it's a moment to celebrate all that's been achieved and all of the progress we've seen because of the web, but also to say, well, what about really embracing that vision, getting it to everyone, and really ensuring that it enhances our world and helps us all progress.
I think it's also an interesting time, because I think you're right that one of the reasons the web succeeded was because it was open, and anyone could access it, and anyone could develop content and publish it there. But there's a counter trend out there as well recently, which is the rise of platforms where people exist and interact on Facebook, on Instagram, on Snapchat, and these more closed platforms and services that in a lot of ways are replacing a lot of people's time, at least in the United States. That comes with a lot of consequences, because those operations are not necessarily open, and they're not necessarily designed for the public good. Can you just compare and contrast, like, sort of the platform approach versus the web approach?
Sure, yeah. I mean, there was, as you say, there was a sort of a founding spirit of the web, which was to be open, and that spirit is still very much there. Now, you're right that there are platforms, there are some mega platforms that we all know and all use, on a daily basis, that exist sitting on top of, if you like, that flat infrastructure of the web. And I don't think there's necessarily a problem with that. There's nothing inherently, I think, wrong with Facebook, there's something wrong with only Facebook. And you know, it's interesting, some of the work that we do in different parts of the world looking at shutdowns by governments in certain countries, which are an increasing problem during election campaigns and so on. I think there was one in Togo just a couple of months ago, and people weren't saying the internet's gone down; they were saying WhatsApp's gone down, because that is their day-to-day experience of the web. So you know, I think that as you say, there is a trend, especially in the US context. Actually, it's not so different from what we're now seeing in China as well, with mega platforms growing there too. So I think the challenge is not to sort of try and roll back history, because actually there's plenty of good that has come out of some of those platforms too. The challenge is to find a way to re-harness that founding spirit and find ways to ensure that as people engage online, they can have the best of all worlds, and that they can, and they're really enabled to truly explore the full open web on an equal basis, and in a way that enables them to create and to generate great content as well as consume.
One of the criticisms in the United States of the World Wide Web is that it tends to be dominated by commercial interests, and most of the media sites, including PCMag, are paid for in part, if not entirely, by advertising. And the pursuit of advertising has led to has altered the types of content that gets created online and the types of content that is profitable to create online. Has the rest of the world is the web pretty much the same across the globe, or is it more commercially in the United States than elsewhere?
I think it is, but it's not so different in many other parts of the world. And as the web grows and matures, of course, more of those platforms are in play in Africa, in South Asia, and so on. So it's a challenge, and one that we're concerned about. As I say, I think that there is the opportunity, and you know, many people in some of these big firms are recognizing some of these challenges now, and recognizing that in the end, the interests of those platforms, as well as for the rest of us, are probably wrapped up in figuring out some of these problems and ensuring that we don't have a purely or a mainly advertising-driven model. So there are, I think, a lot of people thinking about this, and it's good that they are, because that founding spirit of the web is something that's extremely precious and something that we absolutely want to protect.
So barring an act of Congress in the United States, net neutrality protections are going to expire and go away in April. I know the organization, it seems to me that there's some really important consequences to, and a lot of things that really go against what the web was founded on, the principles that the web was founded on. Can you talk a little bit about the Foundation's position on net neutrality?
Yeah, well, as you say, barring an act of Congress, which isn't completely impossible, at least an act by Congress, small letter A, if you know what I mean. As you know, there's a process underway, and we're one short of a vote, in a majority vote in the Senate that would throw a review of this over to the House, and the House in turn could then take the same position, and then it would be over to the President as to whether he would veto that or not. So there's the possibility of review. There's also the possibility of legal efforts to push back. It's really important that all those things are happening, because you know, 87% of the American public, first of all, want to protect net neutrality. They want rules in place that ensure that we can all access the whole of the web on an equal basis. And you know, the FCC Chairman Ajit Pai was here, of course, yesterday. I met him a couple of months ago with Tim Berners-Lee, and we sat down and we had a good and respectful conversation, but we clearly didn't convince him on that occasion. And we think it's wrong. And you know, one of the arguments, of course, that's coming back is, look, don't worry, nothing's going to go wrong, nothing's going to happen. Well, if that's the case, then leave the protections in place. Why create the risk? Why create the possibility? And I think that you know, the big change that we see now, because of course another argument that we hear is, look, there were no protections for net neutrality for most of the lifetime of the internet, and nothing went wrong. But I think there are two big changes. Firstly, the commercial incentives are bigger than ever for a company, given the capability to do so, to abuse its position. The commercial incentives of creating that kind of consolidation in a market are phenomenal now. And the technical capability is there, which wasn't the case even 4 or 5 years ago. It wasn't possible. The speeds were not such that actually it was possible for this kind of single domination to prevail. So, our concern is that it's the wrong step. We're very concerned to ensure that the rest of the world doesn't follow suit. Happily, there's no real sign that it's going to do so. The Europeans are pretty clear on this, and other parts of the world as well. But it's something we're going to keep fighting on, and back in Congress, it's one more vote.
Just one vote. And it's interesting, the historical argument, I think there's a lot of problems with that. Going back in time and looking at the time before there were net neutrality protections, there was also an industry that was very much afraid of having net neutrality protections put into place. So they were on their best behavior because they didn't want to be regulated. And then in addition to that, they were negotiating what those regulations might look like. So there were many reasons why they should be on their best behavior. And now with a free hand, there's no reason for them to behave. Where do you think the first signs of, the first consequences will be? How will consumers notice that? When will they start to miss their net neutrality protections? Like, what do you think that ISPs or content providers are going to encounter in this new world?
Well, we could see this as soon as in the next few months. And again, the companies involved are saying pretty clearly that they're not planning any dramatic change of direction at the moment. But it is possible that in just a few months, US consumers will start to see different packages being offered, and them having to choose between, the same deal at a higher price or at a lower price. I mean, lots of people have seen the great Burger King ad a couple of weeks ago that really illustrates really well that challenge of net neutrality. Are you happy to wait for your Whopper, if you're paying a certain rate versus get it straight away and not 12 minutes later? And you could see in that ad, it doesn't make sense to people. It doesn't feel right, and I think that's the key thing about net neutrality. Even when you get past all of the technical arguments and the financial considerations and so on, there's just a sense of inherent fairness, and something that the original spirit of the web encapsulated, that this is for everyone, it's an open space, and that's something we need to hang on to. And I think what we'll also see, and it'll be less obvious, will be a slow impact that will degrade enterprise and creativity. I mean, it's interesting that the founders of Twitter are passionate in their support for net neutrality provisions, partly because they say they don't think that they might have come up and got the opportunity to get on a platform and reach a lot of people if it wasn't for the net neutrality norms that were in place and have been in place up till now. So, if we're going to say we're going to choke off the next great innovation like that, we've got to think really hard about that.
Yeah. How would you assess the state of broadband policy in the United States? For a lot, in New York City, you've got maybe 2 or 3 broadband providers, but in a lot of the country, more than, I think it's 43% of the country has only one broadband provider to choose from, which is not really a choice. How does that affect the delivery of content and information and just the choice available to American consumers?
Well, it's certainly important, and it's important because, of course, so much of our lives, whether in the United States or in other parts of the world now, are in the context of our connectivity. I mean, I heard a fascinating statistic from a great organization called Everyone On that works in the United States with kids in schools and supporting them and their connectivity. Great statistic from them, which was that now 9 in 10 kids, high school kids in America now, get given their homework in digital form. What does that mean for the 1 in 10? And in fact, there's a lot more than 1 in 10 kids who live in families in the United States where they can't easily access high quality, high speed broadband. So it's a real challenge. Now, the regulatory framework in the US in comparison to many other places in the world is relatively good. But it is a reminder that, when we're now in a situation where being in the unconnected minority has real consequences, whether you're in America or whether you're in some part of Africa or Asia, we've really got to be careful with this, and policy on broadband, it really matters that we are doing everything that we can to ensure that consumers get the best possible deal.
The foundation's been very active in trying to connect that other 50% of the population that doesn't have web access right now. But I've noticed a lot in your literature, you really focus on closing the gender gap as well. Can you talk a little bit about why that's important? Because it comes with some not only important cultural implications, but also financial ones.
Yeah, it does. I mean, we're fully focused on, as I said earlier, you know, we're at that 50-50 moment. We're halfway there. Now, in order to get everybody connected, one thing is very clear to us. You're going to have to focus first and foremost on women, partly because they're lagging behind at the moment, right? You know, our own research in a program that we do called Women's Rights Online shows that in the urban developing country context where we did our research, that women are up to 50% likely to be online. And where they are online, they're doing different things. They are less likely to be applying for a job, for example, or expressing a strong opinion online. So not getting the full benefit of the internet as many men and boys do at the moment. So women are lagging behind, and that's not in anyone's interest. It's not in the interest of the economies of countries around the world, and it's obviously not in the interest of people's basic human rights, being able to explore and exploit these opportunities. But I think the other thing is that what we found, and I spent 15 or so years working in international development and looking at how you get, you know, clean water to a village, or how you connect electricity around a community, and working to advocate for people's rights in those contexts. What we found, more often than not, and you can't generalize, is that women tend to make better decisions about resources in a community and a household context and a small business context. They tend to make decisions that tend to add more productive investments, if you like, in their families and their communities. So putting connectivity in the hands of women and focusing our efforts on women and girls, we think is not only actually in the interests of those women, but it's in everyone's interest that we're going to see progress. And we've got a key metric, a key measure that we're using on this, because the first and foremost thing that we've got to do is make that access to the internet affordable in developing countries. And it's called 1 for 2. So 1 gigabyte of data, we say, should cost no more than 2% of average monthly income. You know, if people sitting listening to this try and do the maths on how much your data costs on a monthly basis, it's going to be a lot less than that threshold. That's the average that we're trying to get to. Now, in Africa at the moment, it costs typically about 10%, 9 or 10% of average monthly income to get 1 gigabyte of data. In some African countries, Malawi, for example, is 20%. Zimbabwe is 40%. So people are just not able to afford that, and women in particular, especially women who are heading their households, where income is likely to be lower in the first place. So that's why we're really driving that 1 for 2 target. We've just got the Broadband Commission, which was the UN mandated body that brings together the private sector and governments and civil society. They've just swung in behind the target, which is great. So we're really going to be working hard on the next steps in that in the coming months.
So what are the barriers to reaching that goal? Are there technical barriers? Is it a institutional issue? Is it about working with governments in order to push that down on the local level? Like, what's keeping it from happening?
Well, affordability is one, and obviously that starts with the technical capability. So we need to have in place the fiber optic cables and the satellites and the balloons and so on that are going to enable people to technically connect. Then there's affordability, and that's a combination of things that we need to work on, and we are working on at a national level with governments around the world. For example, ensuring that the tech sector is not overtaxed. That has been a problem. It's still a problem in some places because it's seen as a bit of a cash cow, but that isn't necessarily the interest of consumers and getting people connected. So there's the technical access, there's affordability, but then I think the third thing is there are some cultural aspects here. I sat in a room a little bigger than this room, but not much bigger actually, with about 200 young women in Abidjan, in Côte d'Ivoire, in West Africa, just a couple of months ago on a Saturday afternoon, who were doing a digital skills literacy class. And the determination and the passion and the intelligence and the drive in that room from these young women who were learning, and as they were learning, they were starting their own small businesses, they were figuring their university plans and so on, all kinds of things, was so inspiring to see. Now, that it is not always possible for women, for young women and girls in all parts of the world to be able to express that kind of determination and use their passion to make a difference in their world. It's not always possible, and we need to break down those barriers that sometimes get put in the way of women realizing their potential.
Very good. I want to ask you a couple of questions I ask everybody that comes on the show. Is there a technology trend that gives you great concern and that keeps you up at night?
Yeah, I think the thing that I would say in answer to that right now is, and I touched on it earlier a little bit, the increasing examples of governments shutting down, using their technological capacity to shut down all or parts of the internet around an election or for a particular part of their country where there may be some unrest and so on. I think there were 60 examples or so of this last year, and that was double the number from the previous year. It's becoming sort of alarmingly part of the sort of the normal playbook, the security playbook for a government that's worried about unrest or worried about dissent and so on. You know, as they bring in other security measures, they'll shut down the internet for a week or 2 weeks or some part of it for a longer period. That's really dangerous. You know, there's a lot of parts of the world now where you're not getting all of the internet all of the time, and it's a trend that's emerged a little bit by stealth, and it's something that we need to shine a spotlight on, and something that we at the Web Foundation are very determined to highlight over the coming months, because we need to not let it happen.
And it's a difficult problem to solve too. I know Google's Project Jigsaw has been doing a lot of work in this area too, but ultimately, especially in a smaller country, there just aren't that many connections going into the country. And if the government can take over or co-opt the local providers, they can have a lot of control over what gets into that country.
Yeah, yeah, and that's something I think, you know, that's something we can shine a light on. You know, that if there's one thing that the internet can do for us, it's surely to help with transparency and openness. So we're talking with various partners at the moment about how we can access some of the extraordinary data that there is with private companies, with governments too, about the flow of traffic around the internet around the world at any given time, and where we see something go wrong, where there's a choke point, where there's a throttling point. You know, perhaps we can, with our partners, can highlight that and get activists on the case and get something done about it more quickly than before.
Very good. Is there a technology that you use every day that inspires wonder and just seems magical?
Well, I mean, maybe if I can give two answers to that. I mean, the first would be, I guess, you know, given that just at the weekend I was the linesman holding the linesman's flag at my son's soccer match on a very cold morning in Oxfordshire in England, and just for fun, I thought, well, I'm going to put my smartwatch on at the start and see, you know, how far I run, and it was 3.7 kilometers or something. But of course, it was up and down, up and down. That I got a bit of a kick out of that. But I think that does appeal to me. But really, it's the web. I mean, you know, taking a step back. You know, I'm just about old enough to remember just about adult life without the web. And the world was very, very different. And, you know, I tell my kids this, you have no idea how things have changed. And, you know, we're going to reach this point, well, less than a year from now, that the web will be 30 years old. And as we also reach that point where more than half the world are connected, it seems like a really important time to take a step back and say, what has this given us? What has the web done for us? Whether it's economically, people making a basic living or making $1 billion, you know, whether it's socially, the way we're able to connect. And, you know, I've heard extraordinary stories in the last few months at the Web Foundation about how people have been able to connect across borders with family members that for whatever reason they were never able to physically connect with and now have a relationship with. Extraordinary stories like that. The incidents of the web helping people to claim their rights, to put right historic injustices through the transparency and the information flow that it's given us. You know, people learning a language, people falling in love. You know, there's so many different ways in which the web has become a positive part of our lives, and which I guess we kind of take for granted. But when I think about it, that still gives me wonder every day.
Indeed. Do you have any requests of our audience? Like, how can they help make that world that you see come true?
Well, I think Tim Berners-Lee, who invented the web, has said this, and I would echo it. You know, if each of us spent just a tiny slice of the time that we spend using the web, defending the web, then we'd be fine. Then the web would be in safe hands, and we'd be able to ensure that the web really would be for everyone, and that it would be protected as a public good that's there to serve us and to support humanity. How people can do that? They can get involved. You know, the Web Foundation and many of our partners, whether we're working right now on net neutrality in the US or whether we're working to drive down the cost of access to the internet in developing parts of the world, people can get involved. You know, they can go online. The obvious place to go, as I would say, as the CEO of the World Wide Web Foundation, is to webfoundation.org and find out how they can get involved. And we need to, you know, raise the voices of millions of people, hundreds of millions of people who say this is something that we cherish. We want to ensure it's protected, and indeed we want to extend it so that it really is for everyone.
Very good, Adrian. Thanks for stopping by. I terribly appreciate the work that you do.
Thank you, Dave.
Thanks so much. This is Fast Forward for today. We'll have more back episodes on PCMag.com. Also, check out PCMag.com for our continuing MWC coverage. I'll see you in the future.